Sometime in the 1830s, a new movement and way of thinking started to emerge in the United States in reaction to rapid industrialization of cities. Henry David Thoreau wrote his famous prose on his experience visiting Walden Pond and existing in solitary. Though his new ways of thinking shared with other artists of the time were not big yet, they were to take the U.S. culture by storm into the 20th century. These were a growing rejection of old values and religion, and a growing virtue of individualism and separatism, especially from urban cores, and even though most Americans aren't aware of it today, these ideas are at the core of American culture. Americans grew to reject the city. This would grow to become the biggest battle Americans would have to deal with almost 2 centuries later. Over the past 70 years, American officials have forgotten the pervasive impact of unplanned growth of the human habitat. The effects have evolved into something so extensive and visceral that people don't notice it, and the problems with it have exponentiated to the point where humans have been unable to measure it. Even Henry David Thoreau knew Walden Pond wasn't bottomless, but people ironically took his expressions to excess, to the point where people go so far to say they're afraid of losing touch with nature by leaving the suburbs. And yet excess seems to be a reoccurring human behavior, but has come to be corrected in the past. Car dependency in the U.S. alone has a pervasive impact to the point where the U.S. General Accounting Office once estimated that national productivity losses caused by highway congestion is at $100 billion per year. However, a lot of people take it personally when the numbers are thrown at them regarding car use in the United States, as if it is to induce enough guilt to make people stop. The truth is, car use is completely necessary in the U.S., and what a lot of commentators don't recognize is that the popular discourse is largely outdated. It's not only people that can change, but their natures, which can be designed around. Urban planning has become a growing need for the American landscape. Beyond showing numbers, proving to Americans that this is an issue is a very difficult task. It's difficult to convince a fish out of water it's drowning when it's never experienced water before. Many Americans have no context for just how bad this issue has become all over the country. Initially, when I arrived at the epiphany of the extent of this problem and created my first video, I illustrated how the advent of the steam engine in cars had an impact on sprawl and spreading people further out into the landscape. Almost paradoxically, technological advancements in transportation rapidly brought people of all different cultures together, and possibly the place where this happened the most was in the United States. The U.S., having never been a complete homogeneous culture, had a growing sense of pluralism that still grows in our culture today. Just as much as the car has been improved over the years, the city is an entity that is never perfect and is a constant battle that is fought. If a country gave up on law enforcement for several decades, there would be negative effects. Urban planning is the same way. The city has a lot to potentially offer people, and yet in the United States, it's not even included in the discussion of infrastructure. From prehistoric times, humans had a need to congregate together to survive the dangers of the world. There was interdependence between individuals to complete different jobs, and they all lived within walking distance from one another because cars and airplanes did not exist then. During times of population growth in larger cities, there were attempts by kings and leaders to create some sort of urban structure to organize urban areas. European cities were often designed in grid patterns, a structure which was brought to the Americas and used for many years. When there grew an inclination to expand outside city cores, there were, still dense, suburbs designed to house people. The suburbs that cropped up in the United States before the Second World War to meet the demand came in the form of streetcar suburbs, named for the public transit trolleys that ran through downtown. The closest thing that existed back then which resembled exurban areas we see today were greenbelt towns, far outside the city, with few amenities within walking distance. The Garden City model, however, was developed by Ebenezer Howard for the city areas just outside the core, but still within walking distance of trolleys and buses. This still serves as a model for many towns around the world today. Unlike dense, mixed-use suburban areas that exist today in some parts of the U.S., these suburbs were not elitist and were not particularly expensive. Many clean suburbs, such as Seaside Village in Bridgeport, Connecticut, started off as public housing funded by the government. It wasn't really until World War II that policymakers began to slack in regional planning. The American urban population underwent traumatic effects of quick population growth and increased cultural pluralism, a fear of other cultures, growing urbanization of southern minorities, immigration, and environmental effects of industry beginning at the turn of the 20th century drew a traumatic blow to the cities. There spawned an inclination among upper and middle class to flee from the inner cities, though most stayed within the cities until after the Second World War. To battle the environmental effects of industry in cities, there came what one architect calls a separation mania between all elements of the human habitat that pervades the landscape today, even though it no longer has to. Americans returning from the war were still inclined to flee from the inner cities because of the influx of minorities and growing population. After World War II, the government, busy with the effects of the war, abandoned any direction of urban planning. Rather than developing smart, denser areas within a city greenbelt, they expanded development outside the greenbelt, unknowing of the negative effects it would take on the American population. This began threading the deterioration we see in America's cultural landscape. As opposed to any direction of design, there came a virtue of separation of all things within the landscape. The GI Bill gave veterans subsidies and loans for housing after the war. Influenced by policies of the Federal Housing Administration, the GI Bill set up requirements for that housing that could be bought with the loans, including those for lot sizes, setback from the road, separation from other buildings, and the width of the house. Veterans were disinclined to buy pre-existing homes in the city with aid from the GI Bill. This, coupled with the growing inclination to separate from the influx of ethnic minorities in city areas, caused an exodus of middle-class residents from American cities. Companies leapt at the opportunity to fulfill the new needs of middle and upper-class housing outside the city. They profited from the GI Bill and streamlined production of housing based on the GI Bill guidelines, and these became the cookie-cutter houses we know from the American suburbs. Probably the most infamous of developers to bank off the veteran loans were the Levitt family of Long Island, building on 4,000 acres of Long Island and in the end housing 70,000 residents. Commercial lenders quickly followed suit, and this became the norm over time. These loans were not used to build mixed-use towns when other developers followed suit. Building quickly and cheaply, the sprawl grew rapidly. The resulting monetary loss of the middle and upper-class exodus from the cities caused deterioration and social struggles we see today. This physical expansion of human settlement was but one example of excessive separation within the landscape. There came a new challenge to build the same amenities people were used to from the city to be available to everybody within the now widened landscape. Thus is seen in today's strip malls and department stores, miles from any given area of residence. The lack of urban core gave need for zoning of amenities, and lawmakers zoned them over time to become more and more separated. As the government widened roads for nuclear monitoring during the Cold War scare, more people bought cars to take advantage of the new roads. The 1956 Interstate Highway Bill created the interstate system we know today. It was a $50 billion endeavor, while the entire yearly federal budget was $71 billion. Those people who resided in the newly built suburbs grew a memory of violence in the cities, which was exaggerated over time. If you fast forward from then to now, you will notice a perception of urban life which was obviously distorted in the eyes of suburban residents over time. People, expecting the norms of suburban design, began to fear the city. Funny how this is the opposite of how it was in the Middle Ages, when the country was viewed as dangerous, and the further in the city one went, the safer it was. Two ways of thinking seem to emerge in the 1950s that affect how most people think today. One is the American delusion of what the country is. Americans, seeing images of rugged people trailblazing on the frontier, have been projecting that onto themselves in suburban culture. This image doesn't depict the reality of how frontier living had a firm interdependence and reliance on tight communities of people all working different jobs. Today, even though things have changed technologically, many people actually believe the areas they live in are country, when areas that look like this are actually considered urban clusters by the U.S. Census. What many Americans don't realize is that these areas are actually crowded cities, with many people, albeit poorly designed areas that can actually be as dangerous as inner cities. There was a second way of thinking that was made apparent when the New York Times claimed Americans had to root out the thinking that the idea of physical form of habitat has social consequences. Jane Jacobs, fighting to preserve communities within city areas, was criticized by a sociologist who claimed she was promoting the myth of physical determinism. Her efforts eventually caused the cancellation of the Manhattan Expressway, which would have passed directly through Soho and Little Italy. Just in the same way the soil, sun, and physical environment affect how a plant will grow, the human habitat affects everything within human life, especially culture. This is physical determinism, and it's not a myth, it's science. The human brain is a thing that grows and functions and dies, just like a plant, and the environment it is in has a definite impact. These two ways of thinking, fused with the trauma to the cities after the World War, gave Americans the impression that anything urban is a scary construct, to the point where many people reject retail or anything other than residence built near their house. There has evolved a false dichotomy between cities and suburbs in modern American culture since after the Second World War. The American perception of what is urban has become completely skewed from reality, and this is the first thing that needs to be corrected. People forget that culture is a very powerful thing that is intertwined in every aspect of society. For those looking in from the outside, it can be really easy to see where things went wrong. Over time, there's been a growing misconception of the relationship between population density and crime. Many people in America have come to believe that a lower population density automatically means lower crime. However, this is not necessarily the case, as is proven by the city of Seoul, ranking highest in population density among OECD countries in 2009, and in a country rated safest on the World Crime Index. Compare that with the overtly suburban United States, which ranks as the 46th most dangerous of the 118 countries on the crime index. Rather than being caused by high density, high violence rates in cities around the world have been proven to relate to factors such as absence of social control, policing strategies, competition for resources, and bureaucratic neglect. People become violent when they need something, and thinking pragmatically about human needs in relationship to the environment is necessary. And yet America is home to 76% of the world's serial killers, according to the FBI. Many of them grew up in American suburbs. In fact, a study by the University of Virginia found that the most dangerous regions of 9 metro areas are in their outer suburbs, and that the inner ring suburbs were the safest. Another study by the 2014 Sprawl Index has shown more car crash fatalities in the suburbs than in the cities. Another study at the University of Pennsylvania's Perelman School of Medicine found a greater risk of injuries in suburbs. Studying nearly 1.3 million injury-related deaths in the U.S. from 1999 to 2006, excluding September 11th, found that car crashes, firearms, and poisoning were the top causes of injury-related deaths, and there were less in the cities. On top of the American dichotomy of suburbs versus city, there is also a false perception that America was always inherently dangerous. Images of the myth of the Wild Wild West pervade our TV screens, and these images pervade the American subconscious, whether humans want to control it or not. People have forgotten that events such as the OK Corral shootings were made famous because they were so unusual. The rowdiest town in the West, Dodge City, during the 10 years which made it famous, only had 34 people buried in Boot Hill Cemetery, and most of them were from natural causes. For those who fear the cities, it should be made clear that events like Prohibition violence in cities like Chicago were also more rare than they were made out to be. New York City murders and rare events which made front-page headlines back then are less likely to even be reported today due to desensitization from the amount of violence we've seen reported in the media in recent years. People have come to think that having a bus running through the neighborhood or a small shop setting up nearby leaves an open gate for violence in their once wonderful neighborhoods. The suburbs are already dangerous. There's no reason not to at least try to design them better for easier access to elements for living. People seem to think that this violence we see in the U.S. is due to the density of the cities. Whether or not suburbanites are afraid of the inner cities, importing their designing virtues and densifying their suburban neighborhoods does not automatically mean it will become dangerous. Many people correctly observe that sprawl is a cultural reaction, but forget that different cultures exist in different places for a reason. One fallacy that has come to popular belief is that culture is purely a reaction to other people. Culture, in fact, is purely a reaction to habitat. The things people expect, their wants and needs, are all rooted in basic human needs in relation to what's available in the human habitat. People are but one factor in the habitat, and culture is built around everyday life, and it changes with the environment. As cities became more and more abandoned, culture, which largely derives from city population, has become more permeated in the national culture as a whole. This too changes with the environment. The thing that people should realize is that the crime they think has always been inherent in cities can actually happen anywhere, but there are more eyes and ears in the city to help curb violence. In fact, according to an article by Grist, more children are encouraged to get to know strangers in the cities while still teaching them not to run off with one, as this makes for a safer and friendly environment where neighbors know one another. And it's been shown that crime rates have been falling steadily in almost every category since the mid-90s. This is not to say that all neighborhoods are safe, but that they don't have to be dangerous. The duality of city versus suburb is perpetuating a cultural rift that most people don't notice. Much of the population lies in the suburbs, and this can be a problem since culture is supposed to derive from the city. How can cultural homogenization happen when there are two different kinds of cities? The same people who feared the stranger danger of city downtowns in the 60s have grown to fear their own suburban neighborhoods enough to where they won't let their children leave the cul-de-sac into their own neighborhoods. It's indicative in this study by the American College of Emergency Physicians that injuries increase as you go further out from urban areas. Suburban areas get more dangerous as they become less mixed use. This is possibly because they are well-populated areas with people who have limited access to amenities, and yet many suburbanites don't realize their false perceptions of what is inherently urban. What's the sense in refusing to live in a place with closer-placed amenities if you have just as much safety? There are not many who could have seen something so innocuous as urban planning could have been the root cause of the violence we see in America today. Many suburbanites have limited experience with inner city and metro areas and have false perceptions of the nature of them or how they can and cannot be. Many of those false perceptions are perpetuated by images portrayed in the media about urban culture. This only furthers the friction between urban and suburban cultures, while there should be a stronger interdependence between them. Bear in mind that the city, an invention explicitly designed to provide populations with safety and elements for living, is a working organism that needs constant work. The American rejection and abandonment of the city could be detrimental to human existence. The city is a place where almost everything outside of buildings is almost inherently public. The suburbs, in contrast, are a place where everything outside the house is almost inherently private. American culture changed to embrace this structure. And thus grew, through the abandonment of urban planning in the United States, the phenomenon of suburban sprawl. Conceptualizing and purely defining sprawl has been difficult. One researcher said that, conceptually, a thing cannot be simultaneously what it is, what caused it, and what it causes. And yet, sprawl is a word associated with problems like car dependency, food deserts, gentrification, car fatalities, and bad economy. When it comes down to it, the word sprawl is a social construct by researchers to describe the cluster of causes and effects rooted in unplanned development and bad urban design. I define it as the excessive separation of public amenities, elements of the human habitat, and people within the cultural landscape. Simply measuring density and equating that to sprawl is a limited solution. The thing is, sprawl affects everything from the economy and quality of life to race relations, pervading everything in U.S. culture down to the psyche. On top of its effects on culture, economy, and way of life, I think it makes people violent, for many different reasons, and yet many people have become completely unaware of it. Transcending problems like disparities in income segregation and violence, this is the centrifugal force causing the perpetuation of all these problems in the United States. Many consequences of sprawl are well established, but the one that is probably most difficult to prove, and probably the most visceral and far-reaching in human life, is the link between isolation that sprawl development causes and its effects on people's ability to develop communities. Perhaps the root cause of the growing agoraphobia pervading the past several generations in the U.S. after World War II stems from the abandonment of any direction of urban planning in an ever-growing cultural landscape. There are studies being done on community and its impact on human life and psyche. Many environmental psychologists agree that people who are integrated in local community report fewer symptoms of psychological disturbances than those who are socially isolated. There are not many studies, however, being done on how urban planning affects strength of community. The problem lies in establishing measurable facets for ill and well-being to begin to determine links, causes, and effects, but right now we have to take the empirical evidence at face value. One thing that brings down community is the lack of access to activities directly in areas where people live. It's been studied and proven that density doesn't have much of an impact on neighborhood ties, and that most people don't automatically develop close bonds or relationships directly with neighbors. People develop relationships through social activities, and with people who have common activities and interests, making art, eating and drinking, sports and games. Many get social activity through their school, but for adults, building new relationships after school is finished is difficult in America. Most adults develop relationships through their employment, because that's the activity that takes most time in their schedule. Even when in a June 2013 Gallup poll revealed 70% of Americans hate their job or checked out of them, it is where many Americans get most of their social activity from. Many seniors move to retirement communities. However, they remain isolated and must cope in different ways. People turn to online communities and meetups to meet with people who have similar interests as they do. And for people that live outside of cities and in suburban areas, this can be extremely difficult and expensive simply because of the need to drive. If people can barely afford to own a car, they're going to struggle to be able to have time for social activity outside of their jobs. There grows the need to observe affordability to travel in the U.S. These days, it's known that the average household in the U.S. can't afford an average new vehicle. Many finance loans, which for new cars have gone up 68 months on average, according to Experian data. The car cost, coupled with loans, insurance, and not to mention gas prices to get to social activities, takes away money for people to participate in social activities. This takes a toll on America's social time. We all know how expensive cars are in America, but if you compare it to just how inexpensive public transit could be, it's stunning. Author Douglas Morris finds that based on a family owning 2 cars and trading every 7 years, car owners spend $560,000 for 30 years on cars. Compare that to the cost for average public transit prices in those same 30 years, and you come out to $30,000 for the same family. There are very few people who study or are even aware of the various pathologies stemming from sprawl, but a few areas of study seem to be looking at it. There is a question constantly raised by many designers, architects, and environmental psychologists. What causes people to feel a sense of place in certain areas or feel more inclined to continue walking down certain streets? It's often observed that people tend to like walking more in city areas than along roads in suburbs because they say there's nothing to see. This could be an effect of the environment on the human psyche. It's been predicted that Neanderthals ceased to exist during the Ice Age because there came more open land and fields. Since Neanderthals were less developed for running long distances, they were less inclined to even go out into these areas and stayed in the, at the time, ever-dwindling forested areas. What if humans react in the same way to walking down long rural roads? Feeling a sense of gratification from walking in city areas may stem from the ability to succeed and dominate in denser areas. There's a different feeling running past buildings, trees, and people than through a field. But this sense of succeeding takes a big part in human behavior. The constant battle of urban design revolves around placing enough amenities within easy access for people without overcrowding. As it exists now, there is too much competition in America's cultural landscape for amenities, especially for areas of social gathering. Think about how much effort needs to be put into traveling to areas of social gathering in American cities today, as opposed to cities of Europe and Asia, where social gathering areas, pubs and party zones are located within walking distance of most areas. Those in the U.S. are largely inaccessible. This inaccessibility causes greater competition for social gathering areas, just the same as competition for watering holes in any habitat. Having only one zoned area for this type of activity, or several that are separated by miles of land, are two complete extremes that are nonsensical. But this has evolved in America's landscape over time, and the dependence on cars people have to get to these places cause more traffic fatalities and overcriminalization of actually doing these activities, which are completely natural in human behavior. It has been proven through studies in rats and other animals that social deprivation and isolation increases anxiety and aggression, especially in males, with many of them never having the ability to regain social functions after reintroduction to the population. I think this animalistic reaction to social isolation is evident in America's cultural landscape, and the cause and perpetuation of many of the irrational violent events we've seen the past 60 years in the U.S. A study that was published in ABC News found that 8th graders in rural America were 2 times more likely than those in urban centers to use amphetamines, and about 50% more likely to use cocaine. The study also found them 83% more likely to use crack cocaine. Remember the controversial Rat Park study conducted in the late 70s. The hypothesis of this study was that it was not the drug itself that caused addiction to certain drugs, such as heroin, but the environment which the animal lived in. Testing the hypothesis, a large colony was built several times the size of a normal cage with access to food, balls, wheels for play, and space for mating and socialization. While the results supported the hypothesis, it became a subject of controversy. Whether legitimate or not, it did raise a major question about the pathological effects of habitat and environment on animals that live in them. This lack of effort put into the planning of the human habitat in America has a devastating impact on American children. While previously, before Sprawl, children explored life in vibrant communities, it has become more and more apparent the effects of Sprawl's isolation are causing aggression and antisocial behavior in children. Many researchers point to a link between social isolation in America's suburbs and mental disorders. Sociologists Barbara Snyder and David Stevenson found teens now spend more time alone, almost 3.5 hours a day. In her article, Marcia Angel details some of the reasons for what has become what she calls an epidemic of mental illness. She says that mental illness is now the leading cause of disability in children, well ahead of physical disabilities like cerebral palsy or Down syndrome, those of which federal programs were created. She also said that the tally of those who are disabled by mental disorders to qualify for Social Security or disability increased 2.5 times between 1987 and 2007, with a 35-fold increase in children as well. Play restriction in children has come over time because of property restrictions and fear of violence in American suburbs, where children could once run freely. People have become less inclined to participate in social functions and activities over the past 70 years in the U.S., and as a result have possibly become more antisocial. If people don't get enough social activity, they become aggressive and stressed. Studies have shown that during the years of massive spread of suburban sprawl, violence was not the only effect on the rise, and that mental health issues have also been increased. It was found that Americans 15 to 19 were 4 times more likely to commit suicide in 1988 than in 1950, and that suicide had become the 3rd leading cause of death for those ages after vehicle accidents. It was also found that for every 2 murders in the U.S., there were 3 suicides. The American Medical Association showed the number of people treated for depression in the U.S. more than tripled between 1987 and 97. Between 1983 and 1995, around the same time as this study, driving distances were found to increase 37% in the U.S., according to a study by the Sierra Club. In 1998, Martin Seligman, president of the American Psychological Association, discovered there were 10 to 20 times as many cases of depression than 50 years earlier. A compilation of studies and surveys of school children and college students in the 1980s reported more anxiety than psychiatric patients in the 1950s. The cases seemed to rise extensively during the 70s, after sprawl had become pervasive throughout the U.S., and after the first generation grew up experiencing the effects of it. The CDC reported that U.S. antidepressant use was up 400% 2 decades before 2011, and was the most frequently used classification of medicine ages 18 to 44 in 2008. 23% of women ages 40 to 59 were taking. In 2006, the American Sociological Review polled Americans over their core network of confidants, or friends whom they trust with personal information over the past 2 decades. In 1985, 10% claimed none, and this jumped up to 25% in 2004. The most confounding thing about America's violence is that if we have 76% of the world's serial killers, far more than any other country, it's either due to the fact that Americans are inherently violent or some other factor unique to the American environment. Research has shown genetic predisposition to serial tendencies, and if this is so, they should be universal within all humans across the world. So how is it that Americans have so many of the world's serial killers? The actual sudden spike of violence we've seen in recent years, what the CDC called an epidemic, runs perfectly parallel to the rise of the American suburb after the Second World War. The increase in violence during the advent of sprawl after the Second World War is overwhelming. One study between 1957 and 1992 found an increase of aggravated assault rates at 700% in that time. The per capita murder rate doubled in the same time and would be higher if not for advances in medical technology. It's baffling when, just 20 years earlier, the time of the Great Depression caused no real jump in crime. In fact, crime rates in many cities actually went down. Many public commentators and researchers have said the decline of public spaces and access to amenities has much the same effect on humans, and that the isolation of sprawl is making people sick. Individual expression, unbalanced with experience of public values, is creating a decline in civility and tolerance over the years. This stems from people being too far apart from amenities. Many people claim there's a need for communities to counterbalance the effects of media on society. Experts say that those who are genetically predisposed to serial behaviors are held back from aggressive tendencies through suitable social experience with family and community that builds tolerance. Sociologist Desmond Morris, in his famous 1967 book The Naked Ape, which was originally censored in public schools, compared human behavior to other animal behaviors. He found that, unlike other species, humans learn through imitation through being around other people. Humans, what he calls naked apes throughout his book, learn through copying behaviors rather than through experience. This, possibly the reason for the relatively quick success of humans, is the reason why we are a teaching species and why we try to teach dogs. He claims this tendency for humans to imitate rather than learn through hard fact is also the reason why societies change so slowly, even when faced with new ideas based on fact and application in real life. A society where its humans have a limited hard-line experience means more blind imitation and less challenge to those imitations through indulging of the natural human development of curiosity. He also found that humans raised in overstructured environments have less maintained healthy relationships. There are many caricatures of this effect in Americans in pop culture, but this stereotype is actually being seen more and more. Children who are isolated can't play spontaneously, and play restriction has been shown to stunt growth. Children have become overscheduled and isolated in sprawl as a result of parents' fear of dangers in suburbia and generally unwalkable areas. The play restriction in the suburbs is just as bad, if not worse, than city areas, but there is less accessibility and mobility. The idea of bringing better urban planning into the picture is to curb these effects of the current suburban conditions that are inherent in America's landscape. Sprawl and regional separatism have a large indirect impact on the human culture and human interaction with other cultures. Just like cats hiding in a box, humans like to naturally hide away as well to feel safe, but the invention of society was born out of challenging learned behaviors around confronting people and becoming normalized to their presence. Confronting people of other cultures may be uncomfortable, but consider the role the comedian takes in providing entertainment from that confrontation and putting people into the position of self-defense, if only just for a moment. Morris describes the act of self-defense the naked ape takes with laughter. Soft play grunt is the equivalent of our laughter. In origin, these signals have the same kind of ambivalence. When greeting, a young chimpanzee protrudes its lips far forward, stretching them to the limit. When frightened, it retracts them, opening its mouth and exposing the teeth. The play face, being motivated by both feelings of friendly greeting and fear, is a mixture of the two. The jaws open wide, as in fear, but the lips are pulled forward and keep the teeth covered. The soft grunt is halfway between the ooh-ooh greeting sound and the scream of fear. If play becomes too rough, the lips pull back and the grunt becomes a short, sharp scream. If it becomes too calm, the jaws close and the lips pull forward into a friendly chimpanzee pout. Basically, the situation is the same then, but the soft play grunt is a puny signal when compared with our own vigorous, full-blooded laughter. As chimpanzees grow, the significance of the play signal dwindles even more, whereas ours expands and acquires still greater importance in everyday life. The naked ape, even as an adult, is a playful ape. This animalism is indicative of the human process of becoming normalized to new ideas. People adapt new behaviors and use laughter as a signal that it feels safe but invigorated. Just as children seek stimulation and challenge to natural safety reactors, adults seek the same stimulation. Laughter is both a defense mechanism in humans and a social weapon against other people. The physical act as indicating something is both frightening and something not worth taking seriously can be insulting at first, but the reaction goes away. Consider again the comedian who has adopted the social role of giving audiences the reassurance of checking their group normality against their own abnormality. The phenomenon of shock jocks in American culture is a natural human reaction to the environment and a way of exposing images in the media and checking them against our own abnormalities, especially since there's so much isolation and so little human interaction in sprawl. Public spaces, which don't exist in America's style of urban design, would provide an arena for people to become more normalized to society. This normalization is the process humans go through in society to develop tolerance and then social norms, but it can't happen without an immense amount of first-hand social experience, something that Americans are severely lacking in interaction with their habitat. This is but a reminder that humans had to have been challenged in the past in order for society to evolve. Some people who experience normalization to people of other ethnicities become aware of the cross-race effect, a condition where humans recognize others with facial features they experience the most. Humans need to become normalized to other people and cultures in order for cultures to hybridize and become more homogeneous. This happens much more slowly in sprawl simply because people don't get enough social interaction. Hybridization has worked in other cities across the world so long as people have access to what they need. Today, many people outside of the United States comment on an obvious lack of unity in American culture. Americans are quick to identify with groups outside their own country or with identities of long-lost relatives. Why are so many Americans afraid to identify as American? consider the possibility that this lack of American identity stems from physical separation. People take pride in communities and places they live in if they are able to take part in the creation of them. This does not happen in the United States. Greater competition for social spaces in the U.S. causes competition to take part in society. People seek ways to justify their position in society and use ancestry as a way to do this. Americans cope in different kinds of ways with growing isolation of America's suburbs. They seek ways to normalize the isolation, however abnormal to human nature it may be. Separated from new ideas from social interaction and seeking justification for private thoughts grown in abnormal isolation of sprawl, they turn to the closest thing they have access to, the media. Over time, images justifying America's growing privatism, individualism, and segregation were what people needed and thus what sold. Suburbanites see no representation of the life they actually live in and thus have no unifying perceptions of how one is supposed to cope and live in the environment. Images on the TV screens have depicted life in old cities and cartoonish walkable areas that are completely inaccessible to most American children who are growing up watching these things. Because of the lack of homogeneous culture for the population to gauge behaviors against, there came a growing competition that begins in grade school and extends through to adulthood between small groups and individuals for control over the tenets of American culture. Competition is American culture, and just like every other culture, it grows out of necessity. It perpetuates segregated settlement patterns throughout the U.S. and causes aggression in the population. We see expressions of this aggression in culture as reactions to the environment that people live in. A lot of these expressions come as a shock to people who hear them for the first time, but they come to pervade culture as awareness is increased in consciousness of the American public. Suburbanites who once thought they were immune from the perceived dangers of the city saw the imminent hybridization of their suburban culture with the so-called urban influence. Within the past 60 years, there have been cases of people and children interpreting expressions of artists who are based in underdeveloped areas and misconstruing them as being a push for a way of life rather than what is in reality a statement to raise awareness of their condition. In a way, it's much like the comedian to sync experiences with other people's realities, but it's important to remember that Morris's naked ape at the core is a creature that learns through parroting motions, and that learning through experience is secondary. This, of course, is the reason why parents may be upset when their children see some of these artistic expressions, creating a rift among the population. Those comedians and artists who defend free speech would be apt to remember the indirect impact their living habitat has on personal liberties. Sprawl is the transcending reality and root cause of all the social problems we are seeing today. Though there is a lot of pluralism in American culture, we do see some cultural homogeneity stemming from the coping mechanisms Americans have to sprawl. It is, in fact, this settlement pattern that started after the end of the Second World War that broke up communities of all races across the United States. Sprawl is the reason and root cause of all the social disconnect and lack of cultural homogeneity we see in the landscape today. Perhaps the reason for the increase in violent images in American media over the past 30 years stems from sprawl and the isolation it creates. People use media to cope with their environment as entertainment to pass the time. Americans the most because there's nothing much else to do. Much in the same way as other things that are consumed by people, there comes an increase in dependency, like an addiction or a need for increasingly more shocking images. More than any other country, Americans have watched so much television that desensitization has increased the American palate for more extravagant and violent images to shock them. Whether or not this is a good thing, people need time outside in order to balance that part of life. Americans watch 23% more television than Western Europe, possibly as a result of the uniquely sprawled American landscape, because there's nothing much else to do. Research from the Surgeon General Office between 1972 and 1982 found a link between media and antisocial behavior. A News and World Report poll found 80% of respondents claiming lack of civility had become a serious problem in the U.S. and had worsened from 1995 to 2005. 90% felt it contributes to violent crime. Doctors have warned that prolonged social isolation in humans risk disease and depression. One study indicates that perceptions of city design and cleanliness have an impact on crime rates in a given area. Taking random online images of cities in Austria and the U.S., people were surveyed on their perception of the city area based on the pictures. City perceptions were ranked based on answers to questions of how upper class, safe, and unique the city looked. They found that, controlled for income, area, and population, the perceived safety scores for neighborhoods in New York correlated with incidents of violent crime. They also found that results for the U.S. cities showed greater disparities in perception for both class and safety. This is not to say cosmetics are the only answer, as this has been proven not to fix the problem in neighborhood rehab projects in the past, but it does show that perception of the environment could have an impact on people's behavior. Another cause of aggression is the growing distrust Americans have in their government. Because of the need for car use by pretty much everybody in the U.S., there has been a growing sense of loss of personal liberties because of government crackdown on people using cars. On top of the loss of ability to travel to watering holes in communities, people feel a sense of loss when the government has to crack down on people doing normal things in daily life. Look at the situation with one Michigan citizen who got a $128 ticket for simply warming up the car in his driveway. Car use is completely necessary all over the U.S. without mixed-use design, and yet people are losing more and more personal liberties revolving around it. People will only find over time their personal liberties becoming more and more restricted. A theme that's almost become cliché is to criticize the American spread of corporate culture. Corporate culture has been forced in other countries to complement their culture, but more than other countries has spread far into the cultural landscape through corporate control of America's urban design, and it can no longer be ignored. People in all countries become defensive to spread of new cultures into theirs, but when it disempowers them by keeping them from fulfilling their own needs, people reject the new culture through protests, censorship, or terrorism. Americans are rejecting corporate culture in many ways, though they didn't notice how the physical landscape of America has been molded by business interest post-World War II. Think about this with the case of the drive-thrus at various restaurants around the country and the refusal to serve pedestrians walking in the area, especially at night. We've all seen this, and this is reasonable during the day, when a sitting area is available for walk-ins, but at nighttime, when they close, pedestrians have no options. These places close their walking areas, claim the restaurant is 24 hours, but in reality, only the drive-thrus are open. Someone who's walking down the street to get something to eat can't do so because of corporate policy of only serving cars and not people. The explanation often given for this by businesses is one of two things. They're afraid of getting robbed, which doesn't make any sense because A, people can pull a gun on a cashier just as easily in a car as they can outside of one. B, cars may have license plates, but the face of a pedestrian can be seen more easily by cameras than a person in a car. Or C, reasoning that a person with a car is more trustworthy. That's just as biased as any other form of discrimination. It'd be like only serving someone that's wearing a necklace because jewelry means money. It's a form of discrimination of people. They also justify it through legal reasons and a fear of being sued by a pedestrian who is run over by a vehicle driving through the lot. Any case taken against the business would mean there's a fault with the design of the lot and not with the driver, which is actually what I'm arguing. Or that they should have a separate window for pedestrians. There is no justifiable reason for only serving people that have a car, and it's difficult to reason why people should only be served based on whether they have a car. This is an indication of worship of auto culture that exists in the American landscape. Pressure should be put on corporations and businesses to accommodate people whether they have a car or not. Rejection of corporate molding of the landscape is indicative all around us in the U.S. People have been rebelling against this since at least the 60s, many of them not knowing it. While American culture may be impacted by advertising, products, and corporate imagery just as much as any other country, what's unnerving is the amount of stake in America's urban planning over the years has been overtaken by corporate interests. Corporate cultural imperialism affects cultures all over the world, but it has affected U.S. culture more than people realize. As it stands now, unmonitored and without scrutiny, corporate control of America's urban design impedes on personal liberties and personal control of land that should be used for communal areas. Suburbs that were sold to the U.S. population during the second half of the 20th century were, again, sold in the image of the country, meaning people were tricked into thinking they were moving to a place with more room and freedom to do whatever they want, and this delusion of the suburbs still exists today. People who have kids and own dogs subconsciously think they can run around anywhere, but they forget that their space is actually even more limited than in cities, where space is supposed to be public. There is actually very little space to exist in suburbia, regardless of the image which was sold to people. Corporate molding of America's landscape is also most indicative in the actions of the highway lobby and its effect on today's landscape from the early 20th century. Key members of the highway lobby included GM, Standard Oil, Firestone, and Greyhound. Back then, the electric utility companies owned streetcars in major cities, and when they refused to sell to the highway lobby, made up of those car companies, the lobby forced Congress to make it illegal for utility companies to own trolley lines through the 1935 Wheeler-Rayburn Act. The Sherman Antitrust Act prevented competitors from prohibiting trade, so the companies of the highway lobby colluded and created holding companies outside of their own, Pacific City Lines and National City Lines. They bought the trolley systems around the U.S. and destroyed them soon after. The vacuum created by the dearth of public transit in city areas drew people away and created car dependency we see today, to the point where infrastructure for cars takes 60 to 70% of America's landscape in the form of streets, parking, and highways. Maryland, a state with a basically average car dependency compared to other states, has 10 parking spaces per car on average. This spread of unplanned development and profiteering even significantly impeded on American farmland. According to the Washington Post, sprawl from metros have taken 1.5 million acres of farmland since 1960. Every day, the U.S. is estimated to lose 2 acres of farmland to sprawl. Between 1992 and 1997, the U.S. paved 6 million acres of agricultural land, an area the size of Maryland. Road subsidies that are spent from taxpayers' money are put directly into corporate complex that relies on American car dependency. The amount of money put into these interests is evident, especially from 1978 spendings of $216 billion in taxes spent on highways, to a 1998 bill for $150 billion on highways, and the 1999 bill delegating $57 billion for airports and air traffic control. This same bill planned to completely cut Amtrak by 2002. Lack of funding of today's rails have caused today's gridlock in America's rail system, recently noted in Chicago. This is especially troublesome if volumes surge during economy troubles. This gridlock is also burdensome on people in areas where rail lines run, as the unplanned development of these areas often cause pretty intense traffic congestion when a train runs through. To those who consider the call for further densification of American cities to be collusion or some conspiratorial endeavor, what is more conspiratorial than the money being spent on American suburbs that we live in today? The reliance on cars and the American perception of pedestrians as vagrants discourages people from walking and perpetuates a reliance on corporations to provide means for transportation. This way of thinking, combined with 70% of Americans living in sprawled, non-walkable areas, perpetuates an environment where urban design is created for cars rather than for people. If people are unable to walk, they don't get physical activity, and thus grows the problem of obesity. Maria Morris, Senior Research Associate at the American Planning Association in Chicago, commented that America's suburbs are designed to keep people as still as possible. The sprawled landscape today's generation has been born into has put them out of access from grocery stores if they don't have a car. These areas, called food deserts, are a big problem in the U.S. Many of these areas leave people without access to quality food and only access to liquor stores and fast food. The connections between sprawl and obesity have been well established, but the sequelas of obesity have been marginalized over the years. Conditions that stem from obesity include depression, anxiety, and further isolation on top of other health effects. But perpetuated isolation creates further aggression, which is spreading through American culture. According to a paper in the Journal of Lancaster General Hospital, humans view obesity very negatively and tend to believe people who are obese are weak and unmotivated. Obese individuals internalize these views and are inclined to isolate themselves from the eyes of others. This only perpetuates an isolation within the U.S. and furthers violent tendencies and mental disorders. However, studies have shown that people actually take advantage of sidewalks the more walkable the design of the area becomes. The American Journal of Health Promotion published research comparing 448 counties and 83 cities in the U.S. and assigning sprawl indexes to each. They found New York County to be the most compact and Yuba County as the most sprawled. People in New York City walked 80 minutes more and weighed 6 pounds less. And those 6 pounds may look like a small number, but it's actually huge for an average and can mean large differences in effects of heart disease and diabetes in the population. This sprawl index found that denser areas in the U.S. were healthier and that for every doubling in the index, life expectancy increased 4%. For the average American lifespan, that's a jump of 3 years. They found that for every score decrease, there was a BMI increase, which leads to greater problems with diabetes and blood pressure, and that with greater density and walkability, there came more safety, better health, and mortality improved. The isolation and lack of physical activity that occurs living in America's sprawling areas have a devastating effect on people, causing depression and raising stress levels that impair judgment and cause a cognitive lag that makes life difficult. Decentralization of America's cities and the social effects of sprawl have a large political impact. The sequences of effects stemming from sprawl makes people less inclined to participate in society. Author Conrad Philip Kodak found that in the 1990s, by the end of high school, each American will have spent 22,000 hours in front of the TV versus 11,000 in the classroom. Since then, kids have now shifted to be sitting in front of a computer screen. But more access to public spaces would provide children with arenas to practice sociability. Many researchers and sociologists have found that restriction of play that comes in sprawling areas and suburbs make future adults less prepared for realities of the real world. Douglas Morris, in his book It's a Sprawl World, suggests simple acts such as halting traffic with buses and parents carrying their children to the bus stop for safety programs them to feel privileged, as if the world revolves around them. These acts, without a context of adults acting the same way and receiving the same treatment, walking to buses, halting traffic, is so unique to them that it creates an expectation of others to manage their lives. Children, without the ability to go to the store and buy milk, interact with different types of people and neighbors, and do activities outside of their schools, never experience what it's like to manage their own time. This could mean less political participation in their generation. There has been a loss of features of local self-government caused by sprawled suburban development. The Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance found that the average percentage population voting in congressional elections from 1990 to 2000 was only 43.7%. Participation in presidential elections was only 50.55%. Compare that with the UK, the European nation with the lowest voter turnout rate, or Germany at 73.6%. In my last video, I showed very simply how sprawl and wide spaces can make governance difficult. Perhaps the reason for people's disconnect from grassroots politics and local government in the U.S. has to do with the fact that they are physically separated by the effects of policies that are being made, especially in central core areas of towns and municipalities. A large majority of the population is decentralized, and a lot of the decisions coming from the local government don't visibly affect people's backyards, so they are less inclined to participate than if they were living in downtown. This sprawled population settlement has created a generation where a large part of the population pushes for less and less centralization, thereby causing a loss of liberties at the local level. Studies have found that most people in the U.S. only know about the president and a few core figures in the federal government, but don't know who's representing them. This is due to a physical disconnect and decentralization, causing people to rely more heavily on elements at the federal level. On top of reinforcing state structure, denser urban design would make people more connected to grassroots politics and become more involved to create a better living environment for themselves. It's also necessary to look at the building and zoning laws that were developed after World War II. As is shown in this image, today's zoning laws would have made most of New York completely illegal to build today. All of the buildings in red are illegal by today's zoning standards, and yet if you took them out, Manhattan would look like most of the sprawled areas we see today. These stringent zoning laws have pervaded much of the landscape in modern America today and are the reason why everything seems so spread out. They started innocently enough with resolutions in the early 20th century to minimize large shadows cast by high-rise buildings being built. But just like outward growth, these laws exponentiated and became far too stringent. There came the habit of spot zoning and isolating parcels rather than considering any direction or master plan for city areas. The 1949 Housing Act created dead zones, replacing mixed-use areas with strictly areas for offices. Many also argue that some of these zoning laws and over-regulations in city areas were a force behind modern social segregation. In my last video, I compared Houston's housing prices with New York's and mentioned that the difference could stem from zoning laws. Zoning, without careful planning, can create artificial scarcity and availability of land for certain purposes, as can be seen as a result of zoning in New York and Los Angeles. Spot zoning should be done with purpose, but often is done frivolously. In fact, it has been observed in city life cycles that the process of development of the greatest cities often come directly after times of deterioration, when regulation is at its lowest. One architect recently observed during a visit to Detroit that the city can barely afford police, let alone regulators. This is when young people are actually starting to come in and make shops and restaurants and start to make the city cool again. He said that he ate at the restaurant, it was tasty, and he hasn't died of stomach problems yet. It's difficult to prove the causation of income segregation by zoning because it would almost certainly happen with or without zoning, but it's relatively easy to see the effects exclusionary zoning and separation of amenities have on people. Greater walkability and access to public transit are proven to improve health and road safety, but beyond that, dense walkable areas also seem to have an effect on mobility. The Sprawl Index has reaffirmed that dense walkability is a driving force that could increase quality of life for people. The study showed that with reduction of sprawl came greater economic opportunity and less spent on combined cost of housing and transportation. For every 10% leap toward density in the sprawl score, there came a 4.1% increase in change that a child born at the bottom 20% of the national income distribution would graduate at the top 20% by age 30. But public schools, having been on the decline in inner-city areas within the U.S., seem to be a large force perpetuating settlement in suburban areas. According to the Program for International Student Assessment, based in Paris, large cities are generally educational assets in most countries, but not in the United States. This is because of the abandonment of the city after World War II and less money that was put into previous generations. While large cities may have a higher demand for accommodation, They also offer advantages, such as more access to educational facilities, such as libraries and museums, and also provide a richer cultural environment for children to develop social skills. Schools in city areas are also less likely to experience staff shortages and more likely to have higher qualified teachers than in towns. Studies measuring population density and how it correlates with educational achievement are not currently sophisticated because many studies can't control for factors that are inherent in America's current inner cities. If you compare literacy rates between two comparatively dense cities, both in and out of the U.S., you find that education is not necessarily brought down by higher density. Compare Singapore's literacy rate of 96.8% over age 15 with Los Angeles. In Los Angeles, it was reported that 33.5% of the population 16 years and over in Los Angeles County lacked basic prose literacy skills. Parents who wish to move to suburbs should make decisions balancing access to neighborhood amenities and school ratings in particular areas they are looking at. It's important to consider the impact the neighborhood has on children. A study published in HowHousingMatters.org found that within the metropolitan U.S., only 13% of all housing is in a walkable neighborhood with a walk score of at least 70 out of 100. Housing choice vouchers and low-income housing tax credits offer walking access at rates similar to the rental stock overall, and 23% of vouchers are in such neighborhoods. Also, the prices of densely designed areas in New York are due to high demand for housing in walkable areas. The thing is, walkable neighborhoods are expensive in the U.S. because they are actually starting to come in high demand among more upper-class people who are realizing their value. Perhaps the reason why dense American cities happen to be considered dangerous is because of their scarcity. Some balance in supply and demand of city area for the population is necessary. As it stands now, low-density zoning and building caps encourage sprawl because there's more freedom for companies to expand outward, building whatever they want when there's no one around to oppose it. The type of urban design Americans crave that builds community has been made illegal through zoning laws in the U.S. Bear in mind that after World War II, when Europe was rebuilding, towns in the U.S. were being demolished for urban renewal policies and creation of highways that created sprawl. That is not to say that sprawl doesn't exist in these countries, but that this problem has pervaded the U.S. landscape far more. Countries like New Zealand and Australia experienced the growth of sprawl much in the same way as the U.S., but did not see the same economic growth as American cities, and worked on combating dispersal through the use of public transit and denser housing design than America's suburbs. Also, people should be wary of dismissing an issue just because it exists in other countries. A problem existing in another country doesn't make it less dangerous in one's own. I said in my last video that kings and barons lived among the poor and contributed to society, but this doesn't necessarily mean that there was mingling. Dense city areas where people lived gave them easier access to amenities. It has been proven that mixed-income communities don't automatically happen in areas around the world, and that some form of policy or coercion has to be used to curb dispersal from primal areas. One indication of the problem is that most farmland in the U.S. has been taxed not on their use, but according to future real estate potential. The problem seems to lie in too much zoning regulation in metro areas and not enough outside of them. Tax laws created for the express purpose of promoting sprawling real estate are also part of the problem and promote dispersal. A study done by the American Farmland Trust estimates that for every tax dollar collected from newly developed suburban residential property, $1.25 in services must be paid for. If farmland is maintained in these municipals, only 30 cents of services are rendered to them, and much of the money is going to schools. It's possible that promoting densification could come from certain policy changes, such as replacing or predicating mortgage interest deduction for home ownership as incentive for movement to denser areas. Many cities around the world are built within green belts surrounding the cities to keep them densified, something that should have happened in American cities after the Second World War. It is one thing for neighborhoods to be separated by a railroad track, and another for them to be separated as municipalities and with several acres of land. That creates a rift in the cultural landscape. The former Maryland governor, Paris Glendening, once stated that every new mile of sewer line costs $200,000. Every single lane mile of road costs $4 million, and every new classroom costs $90,000. Costs of infrastructure are often not paid for by those who create costs, such as real estate and home developers. A prediction made by the Urban Institute estimates that between 2010 and 2030, 59% of the 22 million new households will be rentals, and many of those could still be in sprawled suburbs. Restrictions on utilities in underdeveloped areas such as water, gas, and sewage can be done to prevent dispersal. In Italy, after a 1967 law, real estate speculators had to pay the cost of primary urbanization before developing, such as roads, electric, and gas, and part of secondary, such as schools and parks. Development in peripheral areas should be restricted unless there's significant study as to how it would be done. This whole thing is not to say that everybody should move to New York and then everything will suddenly be better, but that during the exodus from metro areas, instead of building new towns, people just settle here and there without any direction of planning whatsoever. The result is a settlement pattern which is impossible to design for, and a population of people with high demand for denser areas of yesterday. Whether or not suburbanites are afraid of the inner cities, it's no accident that people take time out of their lives to visit areas resembling traditional American downtowns, such as Celebration and downtown Disney. Tourism is booming in towns all over Europe, but there aren't many people around the world coming to see American suburbs. Several approaches to the problem of sprawl have come over the years as people began to realize its effects and the realization of intrinsic pleasantries of resort towns and older small towns. One of the most prominent came in the form of an ever-evolving design movement called New Urbanism, which cropped up sometime in the early 80s. Their approach began largely in reaction to the growing problem of sprawl and focusing on the intrinsic nature of American suburbs, and their early methods have been met with mixed feelings. In the early times of New Urbanism, there seemed to be a redirection in designing communities that resembled Ebenezer Howard's Garden City model from the turn of the 20th century. These newly designed communities started cropping up across the United States, especially in Florida. These communities, while becoming a place of increased tourism and significantly increasing housing prices, did indicate a bit of a lack of progressivism in designing communities looking exactly like something from a 1950s TV show. One Garden City development in Seaside, Florida, was considered a huge success for the movement, but was met with some criticism. As depicted in the set of the 1999 film The Truman Show, as a sterile, boring place where Jim Carrey's character actually wants to escape from, the town was criticized for being too traditional. They seem to turn heavily to designing resort towns, especially since their creation of Walt Disney's Celebration area in Florida. New Urbanism has continued exploring new models, which may be more progressive. Renewal projects associated with New Urbanism in Denver have come under fire for perceived profiteering off federal assistance and bonds, and developing almost English-looking cookie-cutter homes through exploiting this new urbanist push in housing and development. While issued bonds may sometimes pay for initial development of these areas, they don't pay for secondary services such as schools and fire support, as these things are paid for in part by outside city areas that don't necessarily receive any benefits of these services. This, happening at that time when higher class areas are trying to separate from municipalities for tax reasons, may anger some people and has left a bad taste in some people's mouths about New Urbanism. More indicative of this today is the case in Gardendale, Alabama, where the school district wants to secede from the school district connected to the primal city. Their reasoning is that they want to keep the taxes with the kids in the suburbs, which is reasonable, but completely indicative of the social segregation we see today. Prominent new urbanist architect Andres Duany seemed to acknowledge at a forum that this happened under their watch, and that these, what he calls private-public partnerships with the government, are done precisely because of stringent governmental regulations. Because there is a high cost to get a permit, there requires a large investment to begin the development. The government has had to come in and subsidize to fix the problem they created with overregulation. Regardless of how successful their earlier approaches may have been, it was their push against the effects of sprawl that captured people's attention rather than their specific policies. They seem to have become the leading advocates for the push against sprawl, and their ability to evolve has a lot of merit. The success of Seaside, Florida, and its property value increase is a clear indicator of the rising demand people have for dense, mixed-use areas in the U.S., but also how inaccessible they are to those who don't have $1 million to throw down. The movement has come to be a push towards observing successful urban design from the past and creating new neighborhoods based off of them. Many people support new urbanism as a group legitimizing the problem of sprawl rather than for specific building virtues. Andres Duany defined neighborhood as a pedestrian shed, or what you can reach by walking, and most neighborhoods don't have much of anything within walking distance of most houses in the U.S. Another movement, called landscape urbanism, has come to oppose new urbanism, claiming that sprawl is unavoidable and unpreventable, and the landscape should be studied and taken into account in urban design, as opposed to just sticking to traditional design. The obvious solution is a mix of the two movements and a push toward preventing sprawl, but also allowing continuing evolution of the city based on what people need. This is how many Asian cities are developed and have thrived, through careful consideration of human needs in relation to the environment. It's become apparent that densification and re-examination of zoning laws while still combating gridlock are the bigger issues that need to be pushed. One goal, which is currently out of reach of any single architectural firm, is the unifying densification of overall metro areas. The thing that new urbanist developments can't correct is that no matter what type of housing is built or how dense a residential area is, people still need access to jobs and amenities. A residential high-rise can still be a suburb, and people living there still need access to amenities through public transit and mixed-use design which extends throughout the city. There needs to be a more universal solution that extends throughout city areas. Also, areas like Disney's Celebration are a good experiment for resort towns, but places that are privately managed and controlled have potential to increase segregation, and they're often not connected to outside areas with public transit. They have a potential to fall if the company fails. This has been seen in cities that revolved around one industry, such as like in Detroit, and some former textile cities in the Merrimack Valley of New England, the latter which hasn't exactly fallen, but hasn't thrived like New York City. The 1969 National Committee on Urban Growth Policy urged construction of mixed-use towns influenced by England and Scandinavian nations. In 1970, Congress passed Title VII of the Housing and Urban Development Act. This program offered mortgage insurance to encourage development, but failed because it also relies on private entities. There is always a need to develop diverse but interrelated industries to strengthen metro areas as a whole, and concentrated secondary and tertiary industries provide room for mobility. This could come with policies for greater push for centralization and indirect economic measures to encourage growth. In fact, outside of existing advocacy groups like New Urbanism, it could take federal involvement, whether through incentives, universal policies, or tax breaks for service companies to develop. Also, for densification and change to happen in the U.S., there has to come a greater awareness of the problem in Washington. Urban planning, for such a huge problem in the U.S., is actually largely marginalized by the federal government as a whole, putting the pressure on already decentralized local governments, which have little incentive and resource to change, especially since laymen aren't really aware of the problem. Implementing a governmental organization for urban planning at the federal level could help connect the gap between local governments and the federal government so that there is monitoring above the local level. Much like agencies, such as the Departments of Transportation and Housing and Urban Development, there should be a government agency created, a Department for Comprehensive Urban Planning, to conduct studies, share wins and failures, document them, lobby, authorize, and enforce planning standards across the U.S. This calls for well-trained leaders who can envision communities from multiple cultural perspectives. Hillary Clinton once hinted that she would attempt to connect businesses with housing and expand assistance and access to walkable areas to people with vouchers. Since walkable areas have been demonstrated to be low in supply and high in demand, there comes a problem of sustainability of vouchers for walkable areas. Once people come off the voucher, it will be difficult for them to pay the high costs in mixed-use areas on their own. There needs to be comprehensive, dense, mixed-use areas provided throughout the urban landscape for the American people. Obama's AFFH rule predicates policies of fair housing on research on access to housing in given areas. There should be an intent on implementing a Sprawl index, measuring things like walkability and mixed use in these areas. Implementing a Sprawl index, measuring walkability and mixed use, would help give better quality of life to all Americans. Along with increased public awareness, access to legitimate information from an official federal Sprawl index could help people at the grassroots level present individual cases to fight sprawl and implement policies to create better neighborhoods. The 2014 Sprawl Index, a study conducted by the group Smart Growth America, combined 4 factors in equal weight to provide a sprawl rating to 193 census-defined metro areas within the U.S. By measuring these 4 factors, they were able to rate people's accessibility to different job types, mobility, walkability, and proportion of people in mixed-use areas within the U.S. and match those ratings with other conditions to gain insight into how mixed-use living affects quality of life versus living in suburban areas. A lower sprawl score, meaning more sprawled, in these areas is generally linked to a lower quality of life, lower safety, lower life expectancy, and higher obesity. Each 10% increase in the Sprawl Index shows a 3.9% walk mode increase, reaffirming evidence of sprawl's impact on obesity. They found New York City to be the most dense metro area, Atlanta the most sprawled metro area, and Hickory, North Carolina to be the most sprawled urban cluster. They hailed Madison, Wisconsin for having the highest activity centering score in the country. Its implementation of programs designed to encourage residency downtown has increased concentration of people and businesses. A James Madison Park neighborhood included the small cap loan program downtown. Santa Barbara, California, the 4th most compact and best score among small metro areas in 4 categories, was praised for its strategy in its 2011 General Plan update. They hailed mixed-use zoning and easy access to groceries and recreation. Including urban planning in the discussion of infrastructure is necessary because it's important to develop terminologies and concepts that can make the discussion of this problem more sophisticated so people can express various effects of their living environment. It's important to further develop measurable facets of ill and well-being through discussion of the topic, because that is, of course, what this is all about. Using an index to gauge effectiveness of city design and planning and predicating policies on it could be a solution to guiding local governments in moving in better directions. It's difficult to talk about urbanism without relating personal experience. In fact, my urbanist dream would be a dense, mixed-use structure which existed in nearly all metro areas and urban clusters, and a development which looks more like Asia than Europe. Cities like Seoul, where I lived, Tokyo, and Singapore offer a wide range of amenities all within walking distance, and with highly organized, relatively cheap, and diversified public transit. Public transit accounted for a total of 71.5% of all trips in 2010, with rail and bus accounting for 64.3% in Seoul. In fact, it is the case in most areas that you could literally throw a rock and hit a grocery store from any given area, the case which only exists in highly elite areas within the U.S. Since 1980, Seoul's developed a multi-centered structure which includes several central business districts and themed areas with regional district centers. This structure, rather than having just one central district, helps to absorb centrality throughout the metro area. Built mixed use with housing and retail spread throughout the city and connected with well-developed and diversified public transit, the city offers a better quality of life for people. The Seoul metropolitan area developed rapidly, but once followed in the footsteps of the U.S. after a jump in population between 1955 and 1999. 23% of that jump was in 1999. After implementing various decentralization policies, they soon redeveloped the metro area, proving the possibility for it happening quickly. Regardless of whether densification happened in the suburbs first or in the inner cities in the U.S., I believe if the country started working to develop this way, people would notice a huge difference in quality of life. Another solution comes in the organization of public transit. Many Americans view public transit options such as trains and trolleys for their intrinsic value rather than their practicality. Each 10% increase in the Sprawl index shows an 11.5 increase in transit mode. As use of public transit goes up, it can become cheaper, and the Sprawl index has shown that the average percent of income spent on transit as a whole is smaller in well-developed areas. San Francisco spends only 12.4%, while Tampa, Florida, spends 21.5%. Those in Lincoln, Nebraska, were 2.5% more likely to choose transit than Greenville, South Carolina. Vehicle ownership was also shown to be down 0.6% with every 10% increase, and in a car-dependent society like the U.S., that's actually something, because public transit, the way that it could be, doesn't even exist across this country. Most Americans think of public transit as a bus that comes once every 2.5 hours. Imagine once every 10 minutes. Companies offer public transit, and it has been proven to work in other major cities around the world, but it depends on cooperation between multiple companies which may own them, and the public scrutiny over their management. Lines in Seoul, for instance, are owned by 4 companies which were able to work together to run their lines through the same stations and provide access using the same transit cards. Because of the cooperation and deals made between the companies, the public transit system in Seoul is more unified and uncomplicated. The lines that run in Bangkok are an example of the effects of poor cooperation between owners. This lack of cooperation often results in multiple lines sprawled out and less accessible within a certain area, and the need to pay for multiple kinds of tickets. It's also important to diversify types of public transit to decrease dependability, but public transit is most doable in dense areas. One highly contested solution could have societal advantages as opposed to the current system of taxes put into unsustainable highway funds. Starting in denser areas to promote public transit and expanding to outer areas, they could provide encouragement to live in denser areas and raise demand for new small towns to be built. Oil, often considered the biggest contributor to the trade deficit, is also considered, possibly, to be one of the biggest incentives for wars abroad. The tax revenue and jobs created from densification and construction of new small towns are big reasons to consider the gas tax. I think the biggest solution to this issue is simply for a change in thinking when it comes to the American perception of metro areas, and a movement to mixed-use design throughout the U.S. What it really takes for change to take place anywhere is a human push against exclusionary zoning toward densification, and people taking part in creation and change of areas is necessary. American people should raise their standards for the human habitat and teach the subject in public schools to raise awareness so future generations have higher expertise, skill, and standards to make better choices on where they live and participate in public hearings. Agencies also need to be called on to reduce silo mentalities, to study and develop sophisticated ways to teach solutions to the American public. We need to get officials to expand their scope of America's landscape when planning, rather than focusing on just one spot. Outside of possible technical solutions which could be applied in various different situations, there is a need for a cultural awakening to the problem, so there is more scrutiny of incompetence in design and overregulation. Because as society becomes more and more evolved, there's going to be a need for planning of the human habitat to give a better quality of life to the people. It's a problem that completely transcends most of the social, environmental, economic, and cultural issues that are happening in the U.S., and is the root cause of a lot of them. It would take Americans raising their standards a bit and observing the country around them. For as long as people sit in deference to poor urban planning in the U.S., there will be a perpetuation of all these issues, and this will continue to be America's biggest problem.